Good morning. Today is Friday, November the 22nd. This is John Richardson. I'm speaking to you from Toronto, Canada, where the day is just getting started. And this is one of a series of discussions, podcasts, what have you, on issues affecting Americans abroad. And joining me in my discussion today, I have Karen Alpert, who I have had many discussions with, as you know, and fortunately, Laura Snyder, Paris, will be joining us as well. But first, what we're going to be talking about today is something that is very important and very topical. As many of you know, Democrats Abroad has been asking each of the possible Democratic nominees what their view is on FATCA. Mostly the same country exemption, but also interestingly about citizenship taxation as a general principle. And what is interesting and concerning is that the way they phrase the question to all candidates, obviously they have to ask the same question to all candidates, but citizenship-based taxation is prefaced with assuming revenue neutrality. In other words, assuming it doesn't cost the United States any money, stop imposing direct worldwide taxation on the tax residents of other countries, would you support that? And that's what we're here to talk about today. I think what I'd like is for each of Karen and Laura to take a second to introduce themselves, and then we'll get moving with this interesting discussion. So, Karen, did you want to go first?
Sure, why not? I'm Karen Alpert. I'm a lecturer in finance at the University of Queensland, and I run a blog called fixthetaxtreaty.org, where we advocate for the Australian government to stick up for Australian citizens who are claimed by the US as tax residents, even though they are Australian tax residents at the same time.
Do you mean subjects, tax subjects?
Something like that, John, yeah.
Okay, and Laura, tell us a bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Laura. I grew up in the U.S. I've lived in Europe for over 20 years now. And a few years ago, I became very interested in issues of taxation and banking because of problems I was having with both. And I recently published a survey of 600 American citizens living overseas and their experiences. And I'm the sole international member of the Taxpayer Advocacy Panel, which is a federal advisory committee to the IRS. But I'm speaking today as myself, as my own opinions, and not speaking as a member of TAP.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And if I can add, I think that both Karen and Laura are somewhat modest. They're both extreme heavy hitters in the movement, the fight to get these laws changed. Okay, so let's begin by I want to repeat, what the main issue is that we're here to talk about today, and it will extend, I think, necessarily into other areas. But once again, Democrats Abroad is asking each of the possible nominees, all right, question, assuming revenue neutrality, assuming it doesn't cost the United States anything, would you support a move from U.S. citizenship-based taxation to residence-based taxation? It seems to me there's a lot of issues here, a lot of issues. Does it matter, leaving aside the question of revenue neutrality? I mean, are there any moral issues here at stake at all? Karen, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the question is, why is citizenship used as a basis for taxation in the first place? I mean, it came in, back in the Civil War. And what was it like to be a citizen back in the 18th and 19th centuries? It was, you were a citizen of one country, you stayed a citizen of that country for your whole life, pretty much. And so the connections that people had to the country of citizenship were pretty strong. Whereas now you've got people that have 2, 3, 4, 5 citizenships, and the fact that they have a citizenship doesn't mean they have that strong a connection anymore. It doesn't mean that they live there or that they plan to return necessarily. And so the nature of citizenship has changed over time, and really, it's time that that taxation change as well, the U.S. taxation change as well, and recognize the changes in the world since the Civil War.
Okay, so at that time, all right, in a general sense, citizenship was more or less the same as residence. Would that be the case?
Uh, for most people, yeah, I would say 99% of people. The 1% might, uh, you know, move to Europe to be a student for a little while or something like that. But
Mhm.
I think they would always plan on coming back. So their
Return to the
domicile
homeland.
would still be the same. So back then, rather than saying citizenship is the same as residence, it's the same as domicile, which is a subtle point, subtle distinction, I think.
Back then, you think citizenship was sort of a proxy for domicile. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm saying back then it probably was a reasonably good proxy for domicile.
I think that's true today. On the
And I
narrow
don't
question
think
of whether,
that's true today at all.
all right, now let's just focus on that for 1 second here. Um, why do you think today citizenship is not a proxy for domicile?
The number of countries that recognize dual citizenship has increased substantially, number one. Number two, the way the US grants citizenship, they grant it pretty, um, you know, freely. And it used to be that, in the 1960s and earlier, that if you were born in the US, yes, you're a US citizen. But if you didn't affirm that as an adult, or if you married a foreign citizen, um, or voted in a foreign election, or all sorts of other things, you lost your citizenship, your US citizenship. So you didn't have people who were really who were citizens and really domiciled outside of the U.S. who maintained their U.S. citizenship. They lost it.
Right. Okay. So in other words, this is really the result of the Supreme Court decisions in Florium and Terasis in '67 and 1980. What happened was that the U.S. Supreme Court effectively ended the link as a matter of constitutional law between domicile and citizenship. If you put it that way.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think that when you've got a system that's basically treating citizenship as a proxy for domicile, and then you change the link between those two, you've got to change the system.
Yeah. Um, I think that, put it in another way, domicile can be defined in many different ways, but what all the definitions have in common is this sense of permanent home, permanent place of return. And I don't personally see any connection anymore at all between citizenship and a permanent place of return. Bringing Laura into this, would you agree with that? No presumptive connection between the notion of citizenship and sort of equating it with a permanent place of return.
Of course. I mean, just to pick up on what Karen has said, there's so many people that have multiple citizenships. Their parents had different citizenships, and so they inherited both of the citizenships of their parents. And what does it mean? A child born in France to one American parent might not ever live in the United States. It makes no sense for the United States to say we're going to impose tax obligations on this person. I would go back to the question you asked originally, John, which is it moral? And to answer that question, I would say, why are we even talking about citizenship-based taxation to begin with? We're talking about it because it's a problem for so many Americans who live overseas, because they can't structure their lives in a way that makes sense under two different and usually very different tax systems. And so they have all sorts of problems for that reason. So if that's the reason why we're talking today and why we're asking the question of, how can we move to a residency-based taxation system, then to me, the question of revenue neutrality makes absolutely no sense. Either taxing people who live overseas is the right thing to do, or it's not the right thing to do. And if it's not the right thing to do, then why does it matter whether it's revenue neutral or not? There's so many things that we have changed in U.S. law that, because they were the wrong thing to do, and we changed them to the right thing to do. And we didn't ask ourselves, is it right to give women the right to vote? What's the revenue neutrality of that? Is it right to recognize same-sex marriage? What's the revenue implications of that? We didn't ask those questions. We did the right thing. And I think that we have to look at this in the same way.
My understanding is that the original justification for citizenship-based taxation, going back to the days of the Civil War, was as a way to punish people who tried to leave the country to avoid military service. So would I be correct in saying that the philosophical roots of citizenship-based taxation are punitive?
I think that's true.
Right. And, actually, there's been no discussion at all, as far as I can tell, in the United States about whether citizenship-based taxation should continue. That any discussion that at least is based in puts it in the context of the world as a whole, which of course is citizenship-based taxation, because there's so many U.S. citizens living outside the United States, is really imposing worldwide taxation on people who don't even live in the United States. But okay, squarely on the question of morality. Let's say that you were a Homelander American. Let's say you were a Homelander American who was a Democrat, who was seeking the nomination of the Democratic Party. Let's say that you considered the issue of citizenship-based taxation. How should these people be answering the question asked by Democrats abroad?
Well, the ideal would be for them to say, of course I support residence-based taxation. It's what the rest of the world does, and it's what we should do regardless of the cost.
Whether it's revenue neutral or not.
I don't think revenue neutrality should come into it.
I heard someone give a very good answer to this question. In fact, I heard this answer when I was visiting one of the congressional offices in Washington in June for Overseas Americans Week. Someone said to me, I asked one of the congressional staffers what they thought of what we told them about the issues with citizenship-based taxation and their reaction to what we told them about it, and did they support what we were asking for. And the answer that I got was, yes, we support it. And the reason why we support it is because we believe in fair taxation. And that's not the same thing, or that, you can believe in progressive taxation, but at the same time believe in fair taxation. And the way they understood the taxation of people who live overseas, they understood that it was not fair taxation. So I think that they have to answer that question. They have to frame it in terms of what is fair and what is not fair. And I think if you really look at the fairness of, or if you examine to what extent it is fair to tax people who don't live in the United States, you have to conclude it's not fair.
Yeah, especially when you consider the rules that that overseas Americans are facing, because their whole life is foreign to the U.S. So therefore, they have, the most complex parts of the Internal Revenue Code that they have to deal with, that nobody in the U.S. has to deal with.
Well,
how do you tax, an Australian superannuation account? How many people in the U.S. would even know what that was?
Well, to be very, very, very clear on this, there is no doubt that by taxing Americans abroad, the United States is imposing a separate and far more punitive system of taxation on them than it does on homeland Americans. Would you agree with that, Karen?
Absolutely.
Would you agree with that, Laura?
Of course.
So, I mean, it's far worse and it's far more insidious than it actually seems, because not only is the United States imposing worldwide taxation on people who do not live in the United States, but it's a far more punitive system of taxation. And to add further insult to injury, because of the way citizenship is defined, it's even imposing these rules on people who don't even believe they're Americans or don't identify as being Americans at all. So I mean, it's absolutely the perfect storm. Yet Democrats abroad, you know, ask the question in this way. Why would they ask the question in this way, assuming revenue neutrality? What do you think, Laura?
I honestly don't know. I can guess. Is it that there isn't a real will there to move to it? Is there a fear there of something or someone? There's for some reason there's some hesitancy, some reason why they don't really want to be open and clear and really examine what's needed. And I guess the bottom line is I think that there must be some sort of compromise going on, and that's the result of the compromise. Otherwise, I honestly don't know. I can't explain it.
Yeah, I think some of it is a question of education. And, the three of us, we understand the problems. But overseas Americans are the tiniest little bit of any one congressional seat, right? The electorate. So really, I think Congress is afraid of being seen to be making it easy for people to move abroad and evade tax. Not that anybody that moves abroad is evading tax, because they end up paying more tax than people who live in the U.S., because most U.S. expats are living in high tax countries. But I think the perception by U.S. residents is that, oh, well, look, you get a foreign earned income exclusion. You don't pay tax on your income. Excuse me, Australia wants to tax that income at a higher rate. But I think so. I think to some extent it's an education issue, educating the public, the general public, on on the problems that are faced by their compatriots who happen to be living outside the U.S.
I think
Well,
that it's got to be a very difficult job to educate the public on these issues, because there's such a commonly held misperception or prejudice among so many people in the U.S. If you have a passport, if you actually are able to leave the country, then it must be because you're a wealthy person. And if you live overseas, why would you live overseas if it wasn't to avoid our very high taxes in the U.S.? I think a lot of Americans have that perception. And I would think that for any political candidate, and even for the mainstream media in the U.S., it's very hard to run counter to that. Very hard to stick your neck out and say, wait, those are misconceptions. In fact, there are a lot of just very ordinary people who live in the United States. And for all of these very complicated reasons that nobody really wants to listen to, let's explain to you why it is these taxation and banking rules are a problem for them.
Yeah, and I think this is where the survey that Laura did comes in, because it really does show that that American expats are just normal people. They have similar income distribution to the people who live inside the U.S. They aren't all one percenters.
but coming back to this, because of the complexity, right? And the next thing I want to get into is whether revenue neutrality can even be measured. But I really wonder if, if the better thing to do isn't just to take this on head on. Um, I mean, with this kind of these pay-go laws, I think started sometime in the 1980s. But as Laura points out, uh, well, I mean, let me hypothesize this. I mean, there never could have been an end to slavery, or of course that maybe been ended through a war, but there never could have been an end to any of these injustices if there were if revenue neutrality were the test, right?
Yeah,
The other, the other point that I would make here is this: that I believe that there are constitutional issues at stake here. We have already identified the 1967 U.S. Supreme Court decision of Aforium and Rusk as the decision that essentially, delinked domicile from citizenship and meant that Congress could not strip people of their citizenship.
right.
Justice Black, at the end of the decision, and I find this fascinating, says that Congress cannot do things that result in the forcible destruction of citizenship. And there is, in my mind, at least my view of it is, and I'd like to get, your views, is that I think people are being forced to renounce U.S. citizenship because they can't both comply with these laws and live outside the United States. Would you agree with that?
Well, absolutely. This is why I'm no longer a U.S. citizen. I wanted to save for my retirement. I could not save for my retirement and follow both US and Australian tax law at the same time. It just did not work. I couldn't
Uh,
figure out a way to get all those things together.
yeah, and what's interesting about it, Karen, is that and you make this point in your answer that you were trying to obey the U.S. laws that you thought applied to you, but couldn't, and therefore had to renounce your citizenship. Fair statement.
Pretty fair statement, yeah.
Yeah. But the people who don't file the taxes, and this is what's interesting to me, right? The people who do try to comply with these laws are forced into renunciation. The people who don't comply just motor on as U.S. citizens. I mean, at least
Yeah,
that's
wait
my
for the next
perception of it.
IRS amnesty program that'll make it even cheaper for them to come into compliance.
Oh my God! I mean, don't get me wrong. Okay, I mean, I support any program that makes it easier for people to solve these problems. But I think it's worth observing, as you did in our discussion a few days ago, Karen. The simple fact of the matter is that those who waited, delayed, dealing with this as a problem, have been treated far better than those who, the moment they heard about this U.S. taxation, people abroad tried to jump into the system. Laura, what do you think? Forced renunciations? Yes, no?
Oh, John, I think that's indisputable. I would point to two things. First of all, there's the statistics of, how the number of renunciations have jumped up since FATCA was implemented. And then I'd also point to the survey that I just published the results of. I don't have it in front of me right now, but we did ask, so the survey included people who had renounced their U.S. citizenship, and we asked them, why did you do it? And the overwhelming majority of the people who responded to that said they did it because they found it either too hard to comply with the requirements to file tax returns and to live a life under a U.S. tax system, and or they had trouble with their bank accounts and their other financial accounts. They couldn't get them. Only, I think, one person out of all of the ones who had renounced who responded to the survey, one person said they renounced to avoid U.S. taxes. But like I said, the overwhelming majority said they renounced because of the taxation banking issues they faced, just as Americans living overseas. So I think that's indisputable. Yes, answer to your question, John.
You raise another interesting point in your answer there, and I think that we really need to be clear on this. Is that in my experience, most Americans abroad do not owe U.S. taxes, yet they're renouncing. So there's absolutely no doubt that it's not the taxation per se that's causing the renunciations. It's all the regulatory apparatus associated with it, which does, create very big problems. But I would also add that, in my experience, the Americans abroad who do owe taxes can have their lives completely destroyed through what really is confiscation of, retained earnings in privately held corporations or, mutual funds and things like that. And interestingly, many of those people can't afford to renounce, because of the taxation, right? So I mean, I think that one could make the argument that the ones that basically the ones who renounce aren't doing it for reasons of taxation because they don't pay taxes. The ones who retain U.S. citizenship do it because of U.S. taxation. And it being too
John,
expensive to get out with the exit taxes and stuff.
the people who responded to my survey, the ones who renounced the U.S. renounced the U.S. citizenship, most of them had really modest income. None of them had a high income. We're talking under $70,000 a year, and many of them under $40,000 a year. I was actually really surprised when I saw that.
Well, those kinds of people couldn't even afford the compliance costs. For somebody like that, to pay $1,000, $2,000 a year to file a U.S. tax return is way outside their budget, I think. You agree?
There are those for whom that $23.50 renunciation fee is way outside their budget.
Absolutely. I mean, I have seen people on the blogs and that. I mean, imagine a family having to renounce. They have to save up for renunciation. It's incredible to me. Saving
the
up.
big crowdfunded because they couldn't afford it. GoFundMe for my renunciation fee. I've seen it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But, going back to this whole revenue neutrality thing, I mean, we're talking as though I think that, Democrats abroad, by assuming revenue neutrality, can this even be measured? I mean, what the hell does that mean, revenue neutrality? Aaron, what are your thoughts on that?
So, I mean, okay, revenue neutrality would mean that it would have no effect on the U.S. budget. But I don't think they really even know how much they're collecting. And what the costs are of collecting that. So there's two sides to any, budget problem. There's the revenue and the expenses, right? So on the revenue side, perhaps the IRS can run a report, but certainly there's no public information that breaks it down enough to be able to tell how much tax the U.S. is collecting on the foreign source income of U.S. citizens living abroad.
All right. Now, I just want to pause you there for a second, Karen. The way you put that, how much tax they're collecting on the foreign source income. Okay.
Right.
Remember that we agree that with a move to residence-based taxation, the U.S. would still be collecting tax on U.S. source income, right?
Absolutely. And in fact, they would probably be collecting more tax.
And that is because?
Because the rates of, so if they were to apply the rates that currently apply to non-resident aliens and just say all non-residents pay those rates are generally higher.
They get a 30% tax. They get a 30% tax and they'd be withholding it at source probably.
Yeah, 30% tax and withholding at source. So they would get more. Now,
so in other words,
30% is reduced by treaties and places.
Right. Right, but they're still getting, but whether it's 30, whether it's 15, they're getting it and they're withholding at source.
Right.
All right.
Right. So not only is the IRS probably collecting more, but also their administration costs go down.
Mm-hmm. Right, and that is
because the withholding at source doesn't cost the IRS hardly anything.
That's right. The payer, okay, and the U.S. payer would just remit the money to the IRS. That's right.
Right.
That's right. So why not make the argument? I mean, has the argument been made that not only would it be revenue neutral, but it actually would benefit the U.S.? They'd collect more money?
Well, I think that argument has been made, and I think it's been ignored.
All right. Key point here, though, for listeners, what we are talking about, right, when we're talking about, the costs of moving to residence-based taxation is what extent should the United States be taxing foreign source income, right? Not U.S. source. So I think it makes a very big difference.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the other reason, of course, is that there's no agreement on how many American citizens abroad there are anyway.
Yep.
The vast majority of them, if you believe the numbers, are not filing U.S. taxes anyway. Right?
Yeah, I would guess that the compliance rate is somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20%.
And I would guess that of that 15 to 20%, those are people who see themselves as moving back to the United States, who are what I would call homelanders abroad, transplanted Americans, that sort of thing.
People whose domicile is probably the U.S. That would probably be the majority of them. There are probably, it's hard to see in the data, but it's possible there's been a small uptick in compliance by people who hadn't been complying before. The data is just too contaminated to really tell, because all that the IRS publishes is the number or the data from the returns that are filed from outside of the 50 states plus DC. So they've got the 50 states plus District of Columbia, and then they've got other areas. Other areas would include military addresses for people who are stationed outside of the U.S. It would include some diplomatic personnel and other government employees who are stationed outside of the U.S. Mm-hmm. And it would include U.S. citizens living abroad. They're all mixed together. So,
right.
And the number of returns filed in that area is really very highly correlated with U.S. foreign military presence.
So there's really no way to know. But would both of you agree that by phrasing the question in terms of revenue neutrality, these candidates are really given the opportunity to not commit to the immorality, if you will, of U.S. citizenship?
Yes, I think you have to come to that. I think you have to come to that conclusion. I think so.
Yeah. And I think that's a very, very serious problem. And, I think that perhaps an open letter ought to be written to DA about this, because I don't think this is helpful, by putting in that as sort of a rider, because there's no way to determine whether it's revenue neutral or not, number one. Number two, as I think we agree, but Laura in particular points out, this is also an issue of morality. And doing the right thing.
Yeah, well, and to get back to the costs, so we don't know how many costs the IRS is going to save by going to a residence-based taxation system, because the IRS does not currently have the expertise to effectively administer the current laws as it is, because these people are. The assets are all foreign to the U.S. The rules are very, very complex, and the service level that's being provided to these people who live outside of the U.S. is minimal. I mean, you can call the 1-800 number from on the web now. That's not so bad, but and you end up staying on hold forever because you're calling a U.S. number. And in U.S. hours generally, although they've been a bit flexible on that. When they mail things out, they give you deadlines that assume that it's a domestic U.S. Mailing schedule, and then they send it via Timbuktu, and it gets to the taxpayer after the deadlines in the letter passed. So, they are not. They're not properly administering the tax law to make it fair for these people that they're claiming have an obligation to pay tax to the U.S.
If I could add something, I think building from what Karen just said, you have a 2015 report by the National Taxpayer Advocate that lists a lot of problems in the way that the IRS fails to support overseas taxpayers. And they include the problems that Karen just mentioned and a few others. The closure of the IRS offices that used to be in different consulates around the world. There is the fact that you can't, if you live overseas, you can't establish an online account with the IRS because you can't verify your identity if you live overseas. There's a whole list of support issues, very serious support issues that are detailed, as I said, in a 2015 report. And here we are 4 years later, none of those issues have been addressed. Absolutely none of them have been addressed. And so you have to say then that if the United States is going to impose taxation on people who live all over the world, it's not incurring the expenses. The IRS is not incurring the expenses it should be incurring in order to administer that system. And I think you have to take that failure to expend those amounts into consideration, those amounts that it should be expending. I think you also have to look at the fact that partly as a result of the IRS failing to shoulder those expenses, they're shifting those expenses onto others, notably onto the taxpayers themselves, and the astronomical amounts of money that they pay to private tax preparers to prepare their tax returns to show that they, in many cases, to show that they don't owe any tax. You're looking at, anywhere from a couple hundred to a couple $1,000s every year just to produce that document. Now with FATCA, you're also looking at the billions of dollars that banks have to spend in order to apply what is a United States law. So the banks are shouldering that expense, not the U.S. government. And I think the other thing you have to say is, okay, if you want to argue that moving to RBT needs to be revenue neutral, and then you say, okay, if it's not revenue neutral, then we're going to keep it. We're going to keep citizenship-based taxation. But you can't do that and at the same time say we don't have the resources to address these support problems. If it's not revenue neutral, if the conclusion, I don't think it's possible to do the calculation correctly, but if someone attempted it and came to the conclusion that it's not revenue neutral, then by definition, you must have the resources to supply those that missing support. I mean, you can't have one and not the other. They're completely incompatible. I hope I made sense there in what I just said.
Yeah, of course you made sense. You're absolutely right. The bottom line is they're just downloading the cost to the taxpayers and to some extent the tax compliance industry. But a bit, larger, what I would add to this is that, although I agree with everything you're saying, Laura, your discussion sort of assumes that when people go to these private tax preparers, the returns are being done correctly. And they're not. Okay. They are in a significant number of cases, they're definitely not. So they're, which I guess my point is that, they are imposing a tax system on people that really it's impossible to comply. I mean, there's only, varying degrees of non-compliance with this. Now, as we move to the end.
And a good case in point on that, John, is the penalties that have been coming out for Form 3520 and 3520.
Oh my God, this is unreal. I hadn't thought of that. Karen, can you please elaborate on that since you injected it?
Yeah, so if you've got a foreign trust, there's certain requirements that have of what has to be filed, but often the beneficiary doesn't have the ability to get the foreign trust to file something. So the rules say you can file a substitute return with your 1040. But everybody that's done, not everybody, a large number of taxpayers who have done that have received penalties for not having filed the form by March 15th, which is the deadline for the trust. And I think, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing for a lot of this, but the penalty starts at $10,000. So these people are getting, especially the ones who live overseas, they're getting these letters that say, if you don't pay by 3 weeks ago, we're going to start collection action or something. And all for something where they followed the IRS instructions.
Yeah, Karen, I'd like to add something. I'd like to add 2 points to this very quickly. This really, maybe we can make this the topic of another podcast, okay? But I want to add 2 points. The first point is this, and I'm speaking directly to Americans abroad at this moment. Fact that something is called a trust in your country of residence does not make it a trust under U.S. tax law. Okay, remember, you're only filing a 3528 if you're filing a 3520, and you're filing a 3520 in the context of trusts. All right, so first step is to make sure that it really is a trust, because we've seen the consequences of assuming that it is, or taking a protective
a lot of these are
stance.
filed as protective
Yeah,
because they don't believe they're really trust, but they just want to make sure they don't get the $1,000 penalty.
The point is that you should be very careful about filing that. But the second point I want to make is this, that the definition of a trust for IRS purposes is found in Treasury regulations. It's not found in the Internal Revenue Code. And given that the IRS is defining what a trust is, it certainly has the capacity to define what a trust isn't. And what should happen is that these regulations need to be updated to make it very clear that things like Canadian TFSAs or RESPs, and or a UK ISA, or perhaps the Australian superannuation, etc., are not trusts for the purposes of that section.
Mm-hmm.
As we wrap up here, I want to introduce one other thought I have, and it's this. Citizenship taxation has been a topic that's been of interest to many Americans abroad, but not so much in the United States. In my view, that's about to change because of the tax proposals, the wealth tax proposals that are being bandied around by Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and perhaps some other candidates. And, as usual, the academics in the United States, notably these economists from Stanford. But what's critical here, Berkeley, sorry, wherever they are, out in California. Okay?
California, land of the fruits and the nuts, yeah.
Exactly. There's a saying that when the United States tilts, everything loose goes to California. Yeah. But in any case, the point I want to make here is this, that, everybody acknowledges wealth taxes haven't worked in France and places like that. But the reason offered for why they would work in the United States is precisely because the United States has citizenship-based taxation. Namely, people are not free to move away. Okay, no matter where they go, they're going to be subject to these wealth taxes. And I think it's really important that, as part of the process of discussing this stuff, that, people realize that, up until now, people in the homeland, United States, have not understood or considered citizenship-based taxation, but we're now at a point, and this is really dangerous, where citizenship taxation is being publicly described as a way to enforce these proposed wealth taxes, right? So I think that this whole issue of citizenship-based taxation is now in the mainstream discussion of taxation in the United States, and in a way where they're arguing for reinforcement of it as an idea. And the Warren proposals specifically talk about, underpinning FATCA and that sort of thing, which is actually for the purpose of enforcing citizenship-based taxation. So make no mistake about it, and this also should be another podcast, we are definitely living in dangerous times. And this is all the more reason why it's critical for the discussion not be framed in terms of revenue neutrality because of the Warren proposals and others who see citizenship taxation as a way of reinforcing a possible wealth tax, and therefore seeing it as a tool to enhance U.S. tax revenue. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and to some extent that a tool to be able to grab assets out of other countries, because the people who move away and eventually they end up renouncing, but a lot of their assets were generated after they had left the U.S. Well, the U.S. was no longer their domicile.
That's exactly right. I mean, it's like the exit tax, I suppose, in the sense that these wealth taxes, because they are dependent on citizenship-based taxation. And citizenship-based tax, it means imposing worldwide taxation on people who are tax residents of other countries. Tax residents of other countries have their assets in other countries. So this wealth tax discussion also absolutely must be seen as a way for the United States to enhance the confiscation of non-U.S. assets. So not only should Americans in general be concerned, not only should Americans abroad be concerned, but I swear to God, the governments of other countries should be very concerned about FATCA and U.S. citizenship-based taxation, which is nothing more than an attack on the tax base of those countries. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's definitely a grab at the tax base of other countries, especially when you start looking at the position of accidental Americans, people who have truly emigrated. I've talked to people who emigrated from the U.S. 40, 50, 60 years ago and are now realizing that they're still in the U.S. tax system, and compliance basically ruins them financially.
And renunciation ruins them financially because if they're covered expatriates, the exit tax works as a confiscation of assets, which were acquired from the person.
Only if they comply, John. Only if they comply.
That's only if they comply. That's true. Yeah. Okay. All right. Laura, any final thoughts here?
I would say this. I think that when you listen to those who are now in the mainstream media defending citizenship-based taxation, when you listen to them, you have to hear what they're actually saying is, we are not allowing Americans to leave the country. Of course, physically, we can't keep them in. That would be too obvious. Physically, as in their physical bodies, but physically, with their finances and their assets and their income, we definitely can keep them in the United States. And it's a way of building a wall, an intangible wall around the United States. There's no other way to see that. And I think it goes back to something that many people, not just me, have said repeatedly, which is really Americans aren't free to leave the U.S. Of course, you can remove your physical body from the territory of the country, but to live a normal life overseas, really, you have to renounce your U.S. citizenship. So you're no longer an American. So really what all of this is reinforcing is Americans aren't free. They're not free to leave the country. They're not free to live in another country, not as Americans anyway.
I think that's exactly right. And as I listen to you talk about that, I'm reminded of the 2012 electoral cycle where Republicans were seeking a nominee. And I was watching a debate where Ron Paul was involved, and they were talking about building a wall. And I think this is a very good way to perhaps end the discussion today. The discussion was, of course, building a wall to keep people out. And Ron Paul said, "Hey, everybody, make no mistake about it. These walls are eventually going to be used to keep people in." Of course, everybody laughed at him. He was absolutely correct. There's no doubt that the United States tax policies have created a fiscal prison, and nobody is free to leave the United States and live a normal life unless they renounce their citizenship, which is why those who renounce are generally forced to renounce. All right, this has been a great discussion, and we will pick up on some of these topics, obviously, on a continuing basis. Karen, as always, thanks very much for your participation. And Laura, thanks for joining us on this call. Will you be back are you up for more of these, Laura?
Of course, John. Thanks a lot.
Excellent, wonderful contribution, and thanks so much. And we'll pick it up again another day. The great thing about these problems is they're always there, okay? All right.
Yeah, not going away soon.
They're not going away soon. That's right. But hopefully, in some small way, these podcasts will contribute to their eventual demise. All right. Thanks again. We all need to get started or continue our days. All right.
Okay.
Bye.
Night.
Bye. Bye.